And I also call on my co-moderator, Kyron Jason Ho, to introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, maybe everyone. Yeah. A very pleasure to have the opportunity to coordinate this event. So my name is Kyron, and also can call me Jason, and I come from China. And now I am currently service as Director of International Development at Future China NGO, which we are focused on the educations in the China. And we also keep the very close connections with the UNDDC and GNAC. Yeah, so we work for together more than like 3 years with yeah. So very happy to join this event. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Kyron Hu. A few things to mention about our program. Shortly before we started, my earlier co-moderator, Ediola Pashulari, was unable to attend this event because she said she had some issues with a medical doctor. So I had to get Kyron to support. And then two, Annette Dar is supposed to be the first presenter, but we also had Maureen Nkandu from Zambia that is having challenges and difficulties with our internet connection. So I beg Annette to just give her this opportunity to make a brief presentation, and then Annette will comment. On the order of the program, it's actually supposed to be Annette Dar that's meant to start the program. That was how it was meant to be. And because of the challenges with the internet in Zambia, where Maureen Nkandu is, I will beg Annette to please allow me to introduce first Maureen Nkandu, and then we'll go over to Annette. Annette, is that fine by you?
That is perfectly fine. That's fine.
I'm sorry about that, please.
No,
I'm sorry.
No problem at all.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So, Kyron, please, can you put can you share with us the run-off show?
Yeah, sure. I will share the screen. Yeah. Yeah.
The run-off show.
Yeah.
Great.
That's it.
Okay. Please, can you take it up a little bit? Okay, I'm fine. I'm fine. Okay, so I'll do a little introduction about Maureen Nkandu. Maureen Nkandu is an authority in strategic communications and international affairs. With over 30 years of experience in multilateral organizations, including senior advocacy and communications positions at the United Nations and the African Union. She is also the Undersecretary General, Public Relations and Engagement at the Organization of Southern Cooperation. It's my pleasure and honor to invite Maureen Nkandu to take the stand now. Maureen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Very good afternoon from us here in Lusaka, Zambia. Nice, sunny, a blazing hot day here. Just to say a quick disclaimer that I'm speaking in my personal capacity and not representing the Organization of Southern Cooperation on this discussion. But I also want to thank you for this opportunity. And I'd also like to thank Annette for your kind consideration that I could go first, because as you know, we have several challenges here with electricity. And I was just concerned that the line might drop. So thank you all for your consideration. And warm greetings to everyone else who's joined us and on the panel, and other panelists, and also others who've tuned into this very important discussion, and very timely too. My introduction is going to be brief. I'm just going to speak about 3 key points, and I'm sure that we'll be able to elaborate on these. Just also to mention that I'm of a journalism background. I previously worked for the BBC in London, as well as South African television. So I bring in different perspectives other than just the development world. Number one, what are we talking about here? We're talking about the reform of global international institutions, and primarily the United Nations Security Council and the representation thereof. But first, before we do that, let's look at the context, the historical context. How did it start? Of course, it was the victors of the Second World War, China, France, Russia, United States, and United Kingdom, that were predominantly, the founders, the founder members of the United Nations, among others, and so on. And at that time, where was Africa? Africa as a continent was not the way we know it at the moment. Most of it was colonized. Some of it did not exist in its current form, which meant that discussions, decisions, and key representation at that time and consequent years, where Africa was concerned, was done through representation by these superpowers and others, or it was at a minimal level. Now, I'll just fast forward because I'm not going to give a lesson in history because we're all very aware of it, probably better than I would explain it here. Fast forward, where is the African continent today? I've had the privilege as a journalist to report on the continent quite extensively when I worked for the media organizations I've mentioned. And the key work that I did was civil war and conflict, elections, democratic governance, climate change, and other aspects before I ventured into the development world in the United Nations and other places. So obviously, one can see that the bulk of the issues that are tabled for discussion at the UN Security Council are challenges that are faced by countries in Africa. By the way, Africa is the youngest continent in the world, but also the continent that is the second largest after Asia, with an average age of about 19 to 20 years old. What is it likely to be in the next 10 to 20 years? That's 40-year-olds. These are key decision makers. There's so many dynamics that are happening on the continent. It's not just conflict and deprivation. There's technology advancement. It's a new information age. The young have grasped issues very well. Civil society is very strong, which means that the continent, there's the aspect of what are the main issues, what is the setup of the Security Council as regards to what the challenges the continent has, but also the power that the African continent brings to the international discourse. But despite this, Africa is underrepresented on international governance structures, be it the UN Security Council itself, international financial institutions, and other key policy decisions at the World Trade Organization, and so on. So when you consider these and other important factors that we're going to discuss here today, and also bearing in mind what are the dynamics of the UN Security Council at the moment, it's about power and less of values. Whereas, not just Africa, but you look at Asia and others in the global south, bring in a strong aspect of important values about, cultural integration, looking at our education systems and other dynamics that play an important factor in sustainable development. So with this, then, we say, is the UN Security Council fit for purpose in its current format in view of some of these aspects that I've highlighted and we will discuss? And certainly not. And hence this discussion that we have here today. So in a nutshell, very briefly, that would be my introduction. Of course, I will elaborate further on these points as we carry on with our discussion. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you very much, and it's good to, thank you very much, Maureen. Sorry, good to hear such nice perspective from you. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Chiron, to introduce Annette to take the stand. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Okay, so next we will to invite the Annette Daw to start the speak. So Daw, founder of Educational Diversity CIC, and Daw worked for the Department of Trade and Industry prior to completing a degree in marketing. She has served as a marketing executive for prestigious organizations such as Setform, European Group, Fox Sports Group, and Helen Media Group, leading teams of up to 13 people. Dor has also worked as a senior sports account manager in Formula, Premier League football, Rugby League, and Rugby Union. She spent many years traveling to Commonwealth countries and was extremely in strategic business ties with Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and Australia during the Commonwealth Business Forum. Additionally, she resided in Abuja, Nigeria, where she led high-profile diligence, ministers and governors to meetings such as Commonwealth Hand of Government meeting and organized the Nigeria Investment Forum, attracting blue-chip delegates from around the world to Africa. Currently, she is the founder of Educational Diversity CIC, established in 2022 to revolutionize the teaching of Black and diverse history in the UK and beyond. She will be a speaker at the forthcoming International Government Reform of the United Nations Security Council online meeting 2024. So next we will to invite Annie to start his speak.
Thank you very, very much, Chiron, for your very professional, very well represented introduction of myself. I would like to actually say welcome to everyone and thank you all for joining today. We're actually here today because the time for change has arrived. I mean, we probably all agree with that. The time has changed. So as the world confronts unprecedented challenges, the United Nations Security Council, the very heart of global governance, needs to evolve. So when we look at Africa as it stands, it's a continent of 1.4 billion people, spanning 54 nations. So it's very, very important to continue that Africa stands on the sidelines, and without a permanent seat on this council, this mission is no longer just an issue of fairness, it's now a missed opportunity. So for global progress. So what I'd like to look at today is how we can make a case for Africa to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and what the way the world is moving forward, how that gives Africa its place on that Security Council. So if we look at Africa, they're no longer a bystander in global security. They are definitely on the front line when we come to fighting terrorism and managing conflicts over resources. Africa grapples with the challenges that threaten not just its own stability, but stability of the world, because you have now Boko Haram, you have like Al-Shabaab, and that's not limiting to the impact that it has on the continent. So they destabilize entire regions, you know, so we're actually now looking at the global ramifications, and we have to actually see it as the paradox, you know, that Africa is one of the largest contributors to UN peacekeeping organizations, and yet it's denied a permanent stay in the decisions that affect its own security. Because if you look at Ethiopia, Rwanda, Egypt, all powerhouses in peacekeeping, and they send thousands of troops into Africa and some of the most volatile places in the world. And yet we still don't see Africa having a place, a seat on the Security Council. So what we want to look at now is how we can actually change that. So if we talk about economic power, Africa has it in abundance. They are very, very much the treasure trove of natural resources, from oil, gas, gold, cobalt, lithium, you name it. Africa has all of these minerals, and basically the world depends on those minerals for smartphones, and also looking at electric cars. So in terms of a greener future, we also have to look at the fact that Africa is very, very important with these minerals in terms of development and renewable energy grids around the world as well. So what we, Africa doesn't have a permanent seat, and we say that it's not just unfair, it's also inefficient, because when you look at global trade and sustainable development, we have to also make sure that there is a balance. You know, the balance should be that every country in the world contributes to the world's security. So if we turn our attention and the future to Africa in 2050, we will look at Africa's population possibly doubling. And if it doubles, it's going to be the youngest and fastest growing continent on the planet. And while other regions are grappling with aging populations, Africa will be home to the world's largest and most dynamic workforce. So this young, ambitious generation will drive economic growth, innovation, and the global workforce of tomorrow. So the ripple effects of Africa's demographic power will be felt far beyond its borders, impacting labor markets, consumer economies, and migration. So what we should also think about is climate change, food security, migration. Those are just some of Africa's problems. They're not just Africa's problems, they're problems of the world. So the solution that we have to also think about is Africa pioneering approaches to climate resilience, and how this has been something it's being stifled from projecting, why we definitely need to look at having a permanent seat.
Annette, you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Can you hear me
Yeah.
now?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's face it, the current structure of the Security Council is stuck in the past. It reflects the post-World War II order that no longer matches what the realities of today's world are. So Africa's economic influence, political power, and strategic importance have actually soared, yet the Council still excludes it as a rising giant. So let's talk about the economic powers and also how we can have a fair and just resolution to Africa's positive relationships with the P5 nations. They have China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. All of these relationships are built on decades of trade, development, and diplomatic collaboration. So China is Africa's greatest trading partner currently. They're investing billions in infrastructure throughout Africa. France and the United Kingdom, they maintain deep ties through development and peacekeeping initiatives. And also the United States continent, they continue to actually support Africa through security, health, and economic development programs. So Russia also has expanded its influence in recent years through military cooperation. So what I'd like to conclude is that if we look at some of the staggering facts, Africa's home to 1.4 billion people, so that's 17% of the world's population. By 2050, Africa's population will surge to 2.5 billion, accounting for over 25% of the global population. And also Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral resources, which are critical to technology and energy initiatives. So when we see Africa in such a strong force and such a strong position in the world in terms of contribution, it is very, very much important that they are part of the future of the global arena. So they shouldn't be excluded. And what we have to say is that it's counterproductive to global peace, stability, and prosperity if they do not have a seat on the UN Security Council. So I hope that everybody who is here today will advocate for that seat to be made available, and that we can actually welcome Africa in its entirety to be on that board.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So next, you're mute. You are mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. So next is meant to be our dialogue, but she called me and said she was down with some other meeting and she will join us before the end of this meeting. So I'd like to call on the next speaker, Elise Nalbadian. I think she's in the room. Elise, are you in the room? I'm going to make...
I am. Thank you, Jason.
Oh, great. Great. Good to have you here. So Elise, who is working as the regional influencing lead for Oxfam in Africa, will be presenting the findings from Oxfam's flagship report that she co-authored entitled Vetoing Humanity: Why Reform is Needed to Stop Powerful Nations Hijacking Global Peace and Security. The report, which will be published on 19th September, I think that was published yesterday, is calling for a fairer, more representative United Nations Security Council, and also calls on UN member states to make reforms to the current system to address conflicts and the fallout more constructively. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome Elise to take the stand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues, and I'm very honored to be speaking about Oxfam's latest product, which is a report called Vetoing Humanity, which we launched yesterday, along with a few other events. There was a media event and so on. But I work for Oxfam in Africa. So I work for the regional platform of Africa. I myself am an Ethiopian. And what I bring to the report is the African perspective, which was something I fought for very hard, because at this moment, there's a very strong tendency to focus on the three major conflicts: Syria, Ukraine, and Palestine, and Africa remains the neglected continent. We're not just neglected in this in the number of seats we have, we're neglected in several other ways, but then when attention comes, it's also not the right kind of attention. So that's why Oxfam felt a strong African voice is necessary, and that's what hopefully I provided. We did an African sort of press release, which looks at the report from the African perspective, and I'm going to speak from that perspective today. The United Nations Security Council has, through its actions and inactions, failed to protect African populations from violence and unrest. And in fact, the United Nations Security Council is guilty of this a few times since the 1940s, especially in places like DRC, currently, more recently, places like Ethiopia, but also places like Libya, so across the continent. And the reason I said Libya now is I'm going to actually point to something about Libya in a minute. As a result of these failures, we have seen the humanitarian needs on the continent explode. It actually more than tripled in the last 10 years. If you look at 2014 versus 2023 on the coordinated United Nations appeals, you will see actually that our needs have gone up 3 times, but the funding request for us has only doubled. Which in itself is another issue that I actually shout about in other fora, but is not something we highlight in the report, but still is a United Nations failure. Humanitarian needs have grown, and the Permanent Five cannot anymore be the judge and jury on the Security Council. So what we did for this report was we studied the 23 protracted crises that have actually shaped the last 10 years. We didn't even go back further than 10 years. We just focused on the last decade. And we looked at 23 conflicts which have lasted more than 3 years. Actually, we then found out that if we say 3 years, we might as well say 5 because they've lasted more than 5 as well. And 14 of these 23 are in Africa. And believe it or not, 354 of the resolutions of the United Nations Security Council has passed around 450 resolutions totally in the last 10 years. 354 of them were about Africa. But not all resolutions are equal. Let's be clear, the resolutions are quite routine resolutions. They're renewal of mandates and so on and so forth. So to go back to my Libya example, because that's my case study that I studied for this, Libya had more than 50 resolutions adopted about it from the 354. And of these 50, many of them were renewal of mandates and renewal of administrative arrangements. They were not in any way substantive about the situation in Libya. Libya is also a sore wound on Africa's conscience because when in 2011, the United Nations Security Council met to discuss Libya, and we all know what happened in 2011 in Libya. But when the United Nations Security Council met about this, sadly, the 3 members of the Security Council in those days, which were Gabon, Nigeria, and South Africa, actually backed the NATO military action in Libya. So we may not have permanent seats, but we have 3 temporary seats. And those 3 temporary seats, along with 1 more vote, gets us the numbers we need to make sure a resolution does not pass. We may not have the veto as Africa, but we have 3 temporary seats out of 15. And with those 3 seats, and maybe working with 1 or 2 other countries, we can actually work to block resolutions that don't work for Africa. What do we do in 2011 as Africans? The 3 African temporary seat holders backed a foreign invasion of Libya, which has to this day continued the conflict in Libya. So we need to watch out for the idea that we've never had a permanent seat, so we're a bystander. The problem is a lot more complex. Africa is not just a bystander. We are also the authors of some of our own problems sometimes. So this is not in the report, but it is actually in the Africa bit of the work I have done, and my boss actually has seen it as the Oxfam in Africa Regional Platform head. The report concludes that the 5 permanent members of the UNSC, China, France, Russia, and UK and the US, are exploiting their exclusive voting. We know this. And negotiating powers to suit their own geopolitical interests. But it's not just about the veto, which we, by the way, want abolished. And we are also pointing out that there's other systematic and administrative situations in the United Nations Security Council which gives the P5 greater say. The veto once it's cast is devastating, of course. But because the veto exists, a lot of resolutions that could come up don't. So they're blocking peace and security initiatives just by the knowledge that, there's understandings that if this resolution comes up, it will be vetoed by one or the other country. So we have a lot of self-censoring going on even among the temporary members, because they're aware they don't have the power, they don't have the votes, and if they have the votes, they can still get vetoed and it will be futile. I would argue nothing is futile, but it's a lot of effort done for then one country to say, well, I veto this, forget it. The report also points out the other administrative problem, which is the pen holding, which I learned about this year. And pen holding is basically resolutions are written by member states. So some member states actually sort of hold the pen to draft the resolution. And you will find that the tradition of pen holding is not actually a legal mandate at all. It's just how things are done. So how do you even reform something that's just done? You don't. So what's happened is that 80% of the pen holders are the P5, and some of the conflicts in Africa especially are not even considered and don't have a pen holder. For example, there was no pen holder for Ethiopia this year or last year, and for about 6 months Ireland was the pen holder, but that didn't last very long. But we know that Ethiopia is one of the most bloody conflicts of the decade, if not the century, the 21st century, that is. So African countries having no permanent seats is a problem, because, as several other speakers before me have said, 54 countries, 1.4 billion population. In about 3 years, we will have half the world's young population in Africa, and these people need a vote, a voice. But Africa needs to also be a united front. We have the African Union. We should use and follow the African Union to a certain extent. We're not just going to go as individual countries to the United Nations. We should go as a united African front if we want to have effect. This is very, very clear because, as I said, Libya 2011, when Gabon, Nigeria, and South Africa failed to stand up for Africa, the African Union was calling for NATO not to act in Africa. So we need accountability mechanisms in Africa to make us aware that whatever the seat configuration is, we need the African Union to be front and center, to be giving voice to the common African positions on issues. And the African Union needs to be very much front and center in the United Nations Security Council reforms. And the relationship between the African Union and the United Nations Security Council needs to be hammered out a lot better than it is. The United Nations Security Council was built in a bygone colonial era. There were 4 African countries in the room when the charter was signed, including my own former foreign minister, Aklilu Habteweld. So Ethiopia was there from day one. But Ethiopia has been maybe on the Security Council once or twice in the last 75 years. We haven't been represented properly, and we're a massive country who actually send peacekeepers since the early days. And this is a serious problem because today Africa is not, a dependent entity. It is a continent with a lot of potential, and our potential lies in making sure our rights and our voices are heard. We need the United Nations Security Council to be more representative. It needs to be more equal, which is why abolishing the veto is vital. We cannot, even if the veto is given to the 2 African permanent members that are now being discussed, that will create inequality within Africa itself. So we are very much for the abolition of veto. And whatever Africa negotiates, we hope Africa negotiates better for Africa. So the neglect towards Africa, along with the complex geopolitical dynamics and root causes, needs to be addressed properly. We can no longer consider ourselves dependent upon others' goodwill. We have to see that Africa's future has to be shaped by Africans themselves, and the UNSC must empower Africa within the Security Council to address the massive humanitarian and security challenges affecting millions of Africans in Africa. The number of people who actually are represented in Africa is massive. We have, as a continent, the same number of people as China and India, but we are a massive potential of growth for the future, and the future is in Africa. So the other thing we're calling on, and I will finish after this, is that while we talk about humanitarian needs, people assume that Africa actually needs others' help. And let's be honest, humanitarian aid is not charity, it is mandatory. And that's what we want the funding systems to reflect. We want humanitarian assistance to be funded through mandatory assessments rather than be seen as something voluntarily given through the generosity of global North countries. And we want this mandatory funding to be equal to the needs. We can no longer do less and less every year while being told, oh, well, do more with less. That's not possible. You can't do more with less. Humanitarian aid is not something you can actually trim down. It's already trimmed down. We've been cutting rations for years. We've been doing cost-cutting measures, which actually just mean that when the next crisis hit, the people who we were trying to help the last time are right back to where they started. We need to spend more to spend less in the future. And this is the time now. So we need to change the way humanitarian funding is done. And at this Summit of the Future, we think the time is now to actually raise our African voices and say, look, the international system's not really working. It's paralyzed, and it's definitely not working for us as Africans. We need a new vision that matches today's realities and dismantles the colonial legacies that are entrenched inside the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. For this to happen, Africa must have a seat at the table as permanent and temporary members. We need to have all our regions represented. And we need to have a renewed focus on long-term developments, climate security, and several other global justice issues that the Security Council has never discussed. But the root causes of the crises are the reason we need to realize that international peace and security doesn't start when the conflict starts. It starts when humans are thriving and not just surviving. And with that said, I thank you for listening. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, Elisa, thank you so much for very powerful and beautiful presentation. I really enjoyed it. Good point. Thank you so much. We are happy to have you here. Now over to you, Jason. Can you introduce the next speaker, please?
Yeah. So next speaker is Sandra Timmerman. Sandy is the UN representative of the International Federation on Aging. She is the secretary of the Global NGO Executive Committee. She is also the chair Integrations Task Force NGO Committee on Aging. So next we will to welcome the Sandy to share her speak. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm here, of course, for the Global NGO Executive Committee, but my NGO, the International Federation on Aging, is an umbrella for a number of aging organizations around the world. So my focus today is going to be on why older people should be at the table with you when you're advocating for these types of policy changes, when Africa is such a young continent. And I wanted to make a case that we have to look at the aging of the population, because our focus has been on population aging around the world. So I'm going to give you a few facts about Africa that even surprised me when I started to dig into this, because I am a gerontologist by training, but I'm also an older person now, so I can look at it from both perspectives. Did you know that during the last decade, the aging population in Africa has been growing at a faster rate than the general population? So in 2023, there were 110 million older people, which represents about 8.3% of the population. Now, of course, I realize Africa has so many different nations within it. So there are variations, but up in the north, the growth is more rapid than in other parts, and they're sort of moderate growth in Western and Central Africa. We know that the aging of the population worldwide is really a trend. You know, we call it the sleeping giant, like you call Africa the sleeping giant. It's really due to the decline of death at infancy and also the growing longevity rates. People are, even though Africa is certainly a young continent, there is a trend for people to not have as many children. So what we discovered is that despite the fact that there are growing numbers of older people, in Africa and in other emerging countries, typically these older people are unsupported by social programs, and they're really invisible in development programs and policy discourse. And I'm not talking about the leaders, I'm talking about people at the grassroots. You know, there's a lot of experience and talent and energy out there to be tapped into, and it's really quite a resource to get to work together with younger people. We're happy that younger people are engaged in all the discussions about policy reform. We really think that that's important because that is the future. But it's also time for us, for older people. And actually, there are over 1 billion of us over the age of 60 in the world today. We want to be at the table too, and we want to join in your advocacy efforts for reform. We were disappointed, to say the least, that the Pact for the Future, even with its bold vision for a sustainable and equitable society, has no references at all to older persons, while there were 30 references to youth. So if, looking to the future, we talked about 2050, you can see that future generations are going to live almost twice as long in older age as in their youthful years. And so part of the discussion for youth should be to think about creating a society where they want to grow old, where young people want to grow old, and to be sure that rights are protected. And in many places, rights are not protected for older people. I think there's an assumption the family will take care of older people, and that older people are done, they're blocking jobs. And, we have to look a little harder at that, because I don't think there's room for intergenerational warfare. We really want intergenerational cooperation. We are asking for an intergenerational and life course approach to developing programs and policies. So what's good for younger people is often good for older people, for all of us. There'll be 6 generations living together in 2050. We all have families. We have more in common than what separates us. Older people do care about the future for their children, their grandchildren, and future generations. And we're impacted by all the world problems: security, poverty, climate change, migration, and so many more. And we all want to be sure, as we implement the SDGs and the policy decisions are made about reform, that no one, regardless of age, is left behind. So before I close, just a quick note. The International Federation on Aging is sponsoring its 17th Global Conference on Aging in Cape Town in 2025, September 9th through 12th. And the call for abstracts is open now. So it's a possibility, I think, for people interested in getting these issues on the table to come forward at this conference, and we hope you'll join us. I'll put the website into the chat. And thanks again for letting me speak today and for joining you in this important effort. And, you know, upward and onward, we certainly want to be a part of the discussions.
Wow. Thank you very much, Sandra. That was a powerful speech. And some points I took from there is we also must give a seat to older people at the table. Definitely. We need to learn from the older people, because whether the young people or the old people like it, we need to work together. One day, the young will also get old. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. It's really a pleasure. I'm to introduce the next person. Chiron, please, can you make Joseph the co-host, because I know he wants to share. And so the next speaker is Dr. Joseph A. DeMeyer. Joseph A. DeMeyer, PhD, is the UN representative of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, SPSSI. He is also a director in the board of the Global NGO Executive Committee. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome Joseph to take the stand and give us his presentation. Thank you, Joseph. Hello, Dr. Joseph, are you here?
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, there we are. Can you hear me all? Yeah. Okay.
Hi.
Well, you're right. I'm standing actually. But thank you, President Otu. And I also would like to thank your co-president, Madam Pasholari, who we all wish a speedy and complete recovery. I wish she was here. As presidents of the Global NGO Executive Committee, I commend both of you for your tireless efforts to promote civil society, we the people, at the United Nations. Your collaboration with the UN Department of Global Communications on the recent highly successful UN Civil Society International Conference in Nairobi, Kenya, leading up to this important Summit of the Future and this side event, is especially noteworthy. International institutions are notoriously impervious to change. Once established, they create entrenched interests committed to the status quo. Accordingly, transformational change in world politics is most likely in the aftermath of catastrophes, when a major crisis wipes the slate clean, weakens attachment to existing arrangements, and encourages actors to consider novel norms, rules, and frameworks. So it is no coincidence that the Security Council and the UN itself emerged after the bloodiest war in world history. And the relevant question today is whether the wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and on the African continent are a sufficient geopolitical shock to bring about another moment of creation. Now, this is a quote from a report by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They published a report in 2023, June 2023, and I recommend that you go to the website carnegieendowment.org to look up that report, because I'm going to make some further synopsis of it. So a panel of 15 scholars, experts, and former UN ambassadors from around the world were invited to contribute short essays responding to the following question: how should the UN Security Council be reformed from the perspective of your country or region? Security Council being the premier body for international peace and security. And in the eyes of a growing proportion of the world's governments and citizens, the Council today is both factless and unjust, dominated by irresponsible and unrepresentative powers, inclined to abuse their position rather than safeguard the peace. It seems nothing but a paper tiger with minimal impact. Yet the issue of UN Security Council reform has been one of the UN's longest standing topics of discussion. And everyone, including us, our panel, everyone seems to have a view on how the Security Council should be reformed. But these views often reflect national or regional perspectives rather than implications for Council decision-making. It is important to remember that the Council's primary rationale was never to be truly representative. The General Assembly is meant to be the town hall of the world. Rather, the Security Council exists to harness the collective might of the world's most powerful countries. And so the first challenge then is how to balance democracy and efficiency. Enlargement can enhance the democratic nature of the Council by representation. However, too many members may reduce the efficiency of its decision-making and its ability to act with urgency. The second challenge is how to balance interests and values. The Security Council significantly influences global concepts of security, conflict resolution methods, and peace guarantees. And any reform inevitably involves a redistribution of power affecting national interests and value trade-offs. The third challenge pertains to diplomatic strategy. Should the approach be a gradual, incremental change, or a package solution that considers all parties' interests and concerns? So in the end, Security Council reform will require broad agreement among member states. And I would like to emphasize that resolutions by the Council, the Security Council, they are binding, they are mandatory. The resolutions of the General Assembly are merely advisory. But that underwrites the power of the Security Council. They're binding resolutions. So in this context, some propose a shift from a logic of power to a logic of capacity in the decision-making process. This means giving a greater voice to any actor, whether governments or non-state actors like regional organizations, civil society groups, and private corporations. And the General Assembly moved decisively in this direction in April of 2022 by adopting Resolution 76/262. You may want to look that up. Resolution 76-262, requiring that permanent members who use their veto power must provide justification within 10 days to all UN member states. And this unprecedented action by the General Assembly represents an important step forward in reforming the Security Council. Now, the Council's legitimacy crisis stems less, they believe, from its lack of representativeness than from the uneven implications of its resolutions, including any punitive actions like sanctions and international isolation, and to the tendency of its most powerful members to bypass the Council entirely in favor of unilateral action. So I could share with you a PowerPoint slide, but I have decided at the final moment that PowerPoint can corrupt. So the panel has made many recommendations, and you can look that up if you go to the publication by the Carnegie Endowment, and you will see all those recommendations. But the essence of those recommendations definitely include more transparency and how the Security Council arrives at its decisions, more communication between the Security Council and the General Assembly and its members, and also encourages regional members to have more of a caucus approach. And I think this particularly can apply to Africa. Yeah, with, there are geographical, if not also social, cultural differences on that wonderful continent. But those member states must make maybe more effort to arrive at the caucus as a region and thereby assert their power. Again, you can follow those recommendations on the website of carnegieendowment.org. I can also make it available as a slide. So the second recommendations have been made by my dear intern graduate student of my NGO, Miss Yuan Ruo Xu, Y-U-A-N-R-U-O, Yuan Ruo X-U, Xu. She's a graduate student in psychology, does her internship right now at Harvard Medical School. And she puts together, and that slide I will also make available through you, Mr. Otu, to people, but she emphasizes the need to prevent armed conflict before they erupt by early identification and by early intervention and resolution, instead of the Security Council reacting after armed conflicts have erupted. And she also wants to emphasize, as a youth representative, the important role by civil society and its NGOs who have their ears to the ground and their eyes in the field in this early intervention and prevention process. The NGOs in the field, they can identify, they pick up what's going on and what may erupt into an armed conflict. So she proposes a task force to make sure that we have the means, and maybe artificial intelligence could contribute to that, to identify these factors that contribute before they evolve and explode into armed conflicts. And she also would like to see civil society more involved in the decision-making process. So have a seat at the table. As I said earlier, it may interfere with the efficiency of the Security Council. So a bottom-up approach may be the most valuable alternative route to strengthen the UN system. As its legitimacy wanes, the temptation for dissatisfied countries to bypass the Security Council is likely to become greater and more understandable. However, letting the Security Council go the way of the bygone League of Nations would be unacceptable. Yeah, there are historical precedents that an international organization fails. And hopefully we can prevent that from happening. Addressing the legitimacy crisis is thus imperative, since there is no substitute of multilateral venue for global coordination on critical questions of international peace and security. Without the Security Council, even nominal adherence to norms of peaceful conflict management, individual rights, and the protection of civilians could fall away. So to finish, in conclusion, we are more than ever confronted with a civil and moral imperative. Civil as we, the people, and civil society, moral as in the authority established by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and imperative as in the urgent need for action here and now. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Jason, I think it's your turn to make the next introduction. Or is it me?
Yeah. Yeah, so next speaker is Monica Mayhem. Monica Mayhem, LLB and is an EU and Brazilian senior regulatory lawyer with focus on technology and sustainability. Having worked for over 17 years in London, England, Monica has offered legal advice from working in global leading law firms, Clifford Chance and Herbert Smith, and Big Four consultants, doting to top-tier technology and media companies, Accurate, GD, and BBC. Most recently, she was invited to participate at COP28 UN Nairobi conference and spoken at panels such as G20 in Brazil. Monica is a trustee of National Alliance of Women Organizations in the UK, facilitates sought-after workshops with the FCDU UK, and regularly consult with them in meeting for the review of the Pact for the Future and its 5 chapters. Monica is a convener and co-convener of several women and girls working groups, including institutionals, marxism, and the environment with the women and girls space, bridges policy gaps, and creating dialogue with UNECE member states for Beijing's for +30 in Geneva. She is an active member of the G20 Environment, WG, IEF, EBBF, and OPA UK, a convener and public speakers in topics such as creations of legal frameworks, international governance, AI, and environment. So next, let's welcome the Monica to share her speak. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chiron. It was a very long description, but I would just say that I'm a learner, as all of us are here, and we're here to learn. There is quite a lot to be shared as well. But first of all, I would like really to thank the organizers very much for inviting me, and also for inviting this diversity of speakers. It's very nice to see a diversity of speakers here. I think that the best way of focusing my time is really to concentrate on the legal framework and the institutional mechanisms of the UN Security Council, and also offer a proposal for a second UN Charter. I don't know how much each of you have been involved with the proposal of the UN Charter for a second proposal. And I see as well that there is a very important need to embrace the principle of interdependence of the world, especially with the principle of, oneness of humanity and diversity not being uniformity, but with room for optimism and hope. That we know the world nowadays is in profound crisis, and it's very, very different than what it was at the time of the UN Charter in 1945. The global governance structures are ill-suited to today's reality. The institutions are required to be created and reformed, and we know that this will whether voluntarily come about as an act of collective will, or only after further catastrophes, which we want to avoid. And it's really the choice before us today. And I see that the challenges to human security today reach far beyond those addressed in the original UN Charter. I would like to address two existential threats that humanity is going through. One is the triple planetary crisis, which is the climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, which are interconnected crises that transcend national borders. If we just think about that, if we just think about national sovereignty and about what the interests of the government, of the national governments entail, we will be leaving behind any impact that is provided into the environment. And we know by having no centralized body to bring elements from the agreed treaties for their implementation means that multilateral agreements and sustainable development treaties are encapsulated and not supported by a centralized institutional mechanism. So that is a problem itself. The proposal then is that the United Nations have a United Nations Charter reform as well. And that is in a much bigger scale, creating new governance structure and also adopting principles of global solidarity. The second problem that is of extreme importance and another existential threat for humanity is the nuclear war subject. So although we know that disarmament and arm control have been central to the United Nations mission since its foundation, there is a widening gap between the intention of the UN Charter to achieve collective security in the growing risks posed by the potential of a nuclear war or conventional weapons, and also the use of technology that has been evolving. The UN Security Council was established to prevent wars like the Second World War, but its ability to mitigate the growing risks of nuclear warfare has diminished that. The reform really needs to focus on these new threats, including robust monitoring, verification mechanisms, ensuring compliance with disarmament commitments, establishing preventive measures for the new forms of war that can come, but also thinking about the comprehensive solution, including staged disarmament and international peace force with legal authority to act on behalf of the international community, not just on the interests of specific member states that are part of P5 or and this would really empower the UN to provide reliable global peace and security, because we're talking about the whole world. And the Security Council represents security and peace for every member of the human race. So I see that the UN Security Council is essentially the executive arm of the UN and has been the subject of more reform proposals than any other UN institution. While there are rotations of non-permanent members, the facto power to violate the principles and purpose of the UN Charter in their perceived national interest has been really a very big issue, and this has really weakened the moral foundation of that body and paralyzed it in face of great power conflicts. I would be very happy to send here the second charter proposal that has been provided by this organization called International Governance Forum. I will add it in the chat. But also to very briefly mention about the original UN Charter, how even with Article 109, it offered a concession that for those countries that were deeply concerned about the concentration of power vested in the five permanent members of the UN Security Council, they could use that to amend the charter in the future. So we know that there is a possibility here, and we know that this process can be initiated by a 2/3 vote of the members of the UN General Assembly and a vote of any 9 members of the Security Council. And I think that that is very important to be emphasized. The other point as well is about this of reimagining a renewed United Nations. How would it look like? You know, I think that it's important that we think about how this renewed UN must be. You know, must be able to enforce global agreements, shift away from state-based systems, embrace this principle of oneness, leaving no one behind, and really like coming about points that it addresses some of the main issues that at the moment the Security Council is having, which is the current composition and the working methods, which are not adequately reflecting the geopolitical realities of the 21st century. We know that the Summit of the Future is coming up soon on Monday and Tuesday on September 22nd and 23rd. And it's really a very important occasion to address this point of the outdated UN Charter, but also to think about how do we create a sense of optimism and hope, opposite to a sense of giving up or digging in and disappearing. And I think that it's about really like embracing these concepts of interdependence, finding strategic avenues of action, reimagining realistic and not live in an alternative, but finding answers to behaviors that are not in accordance to the reality of the international community, and finding really what are the urgencies and the red flags that are required to be treated with pragmatism and not delusioning ourselves. This is really an unprecedented opportunity to rethink about the framework of global governance. And this proposal really is another attempt, but it should really be an attempt to reform institutions like the United Nations Security Council, which will only perpetuate division and inequality if the principle of the oneness of humanity and interdependence is not really installed at the heart of the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm here. Please, can you put the next speaker, the screenshot, so I can?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, no worries. I will to introduce the next speaker. Yeah. So let's welcome the Nastasia Shermachi. Nastasia Shermachi is the Global Program Advisor to the CEO of the International Sustainable Development Resource Center, Geneva, Switzerland. Yeah. So let's welcome the Nastasia. Yeah.
Distinguished guests, So yes, I come here just representing some of the youth points raised by some of our African youth. Just to be brief and precise without necessary quoting. So first and foremost, we seek to the notion of global governance, and it's, as we notice, it's a noble endeavor. However, it's born a divide between generations within our regions, within the youth as well, and within the generations. Why we mention generations is that there are various rifts that we may mention. Either it could be either culturally, it could be either with the different levels of exposure. Hence the reason why we listed this as one of our main points, that advocating for a seat will enable a set understanding of our certain agendas together as the youth, as well as with the current leaders and leaders to be in the next coming months or years. Now diving into the ill representation, which has been a testament to the endured historical injustices that have continued. Going firstly into our first point, there's somewhat of a rift, or an intergenerational rift, which has been once again noted by the vast majority of youths. And again, most of the points I'm bringing, this is for discussion if we do have time for discussion. Now diving once again into our third point, which is the known irony that our very continent that borne the brunt of colonialism, conflict, and economic exploitation remains marginalized at the highest tables of global governance. So this is in the various, this we could seek the notion in the various forms of, it could be technological advancements in infrastructure, advancements in social growth as well. And this also encompasses our proximity of our regions in awareness of the conflicts and instabilities of the current time. Now coming into our additional point, we also seek some form of drive and drive for awareness and drive for endorsement of the African Union's Agenda 2063, which has the various points. We have sought an understanding that being able to advocate for these necessary seats will also need the integration of the few points and a few aims under the AU in order for the youth to be catered for in such regard. In closing, I'll just mention that the youthful demographic faces unparalleled opportunities for global advancement only through the integration and the presence of Africa on the Security Council, as this enables the youth of tomorrow to have a voice for years to come. So this again is mentioned that we are currently living in the present, however, that there is a time to come in the next 20, 30 years, which we do seek to achieve Agenda 2063. So yes, again, thank you once again for the opportunity just to present these very fine but precise points, but it truly would be up for discussion and further elaborations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And sorry, my internet is fluctuating because there's a thunderstorm currently. So in case I'm cut off, you know that I'm cut off because of the internet.
No,
Mr. Sano, are you here? The next speaker is meant to be Sano. Mr. Sano, are you here? Hakatazuman Sano, can you confirm that you are in here with us? I saw him earlier on. I think maybe he left. Mr. Sano, are you here? No. Okay. So maybe we'll move on to the next speaker, Dr. Aliyu Ibrahim. Are you here too? Dr. Ali Ibrahim is the chairman of the board of the Irish Dairy Group that also helped us to co-partner with us in doing this. Maybe we also move on to the next speaker, Chiron Hu. Chiron works with the NGO P2 China as the head of international business development. He was the vice president of the Chinese Student and Scholars Association at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, UK, and acted as the Deputy Minister, Entrepreneurship Development Department of the Chinese Student and Scholars Association in the UK, that's CSSA UK, London, or London, UK. He was a team member of the G20 YEA-CFI held in China. So, Mr. Chiron, the floor is yours. Over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. So, distinguished chairman, esteemed guests, good morning, afternoon, or evening. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak these meetings as a representative. First, let me introduce myself briefly. My name is Chiron and come from China. I graduated from University College London with a degree in philosophy of education. I'm currently serving as the Director of International Development at Future China NGO and work in the field of VR and education. Today, we're discussing the topic, why we need reform of the United Nations. As we all know, the world we live in has undergone tremendous changes, particularly after the pandemic. The economic development of various countries has been significantly impacted. Meanwhile, the rapid development of artificial intelligence and media is reshaping the global landscape and dynamics. Conflicts between regions have also caused many people to lose stable living environments. However, the United Nations has not effectively invested in this process since its establishment in 1945. There have been numerous adjustments and changes in global politics and economy dynamics. In my view, emerging countries such as India, Brazil, and South Africa are playing increasingly important roles in global affairs, but they lack adequate representations with the United Nations. As a result, the handling of certain issues or the proposed solutions may not adapted address the needs of these countries. Under the correct UN system, the organization sometimes gets stuck because certain countries act on their own or big powers are competing with each other. This can make the UN less effective. In my view, one of the most important goals of UN reform should be finding better ways to ensure that all countries can take part equally and have real conversations about global issues. As a Chinese national, I'd like to briefly share my position. China, as the largest developing country, has long been committed to evaluate the voice of developing nations. UN reform should aim to grant more wind to developing countries in decision-making process, helping to balance the interests of developed and developing countries, especially in areas like development issues, poverty alleviations, and infrastructure development. I believe reform can help enhance representations and rights of developing nations with the UN. Although China, as a permanent member of the Security Council, holds vote power, I believe it's crucial to give more consideration to the perspectives of various countries, especially smaller and medium-sized nations during UN meetings. China has advocated the concept of a community with a shared future for market. The world as a whole is interconnected. In the face of existing crises or challenges, we should strive to unite and develop together, rather than focus solely on our own national interests. When it comes to issues like climate change and poverty reduction, the UN should take on more responsibilities and play a large role. As the head of an educational nonprofit organizations, my own experience teaching in rural secondary schools in China has allowed me to deeply understand that education is one of the fundamental pathways to elevating poverty. I hope that in the future we will see the UN drive like UNIC, UNICEF, and UNESCO to offer more assistance, enable more young people to acquire skills, and reduce the impacts of unemployment and poverty. Finally, I would like to see that in this area, the advent of artificial intelligence has greatly improved our work efficiency. I hope that through reform, the UN can keep pace with the times and societal development by selectively utilities AI to simplify works process and increase efficiency, ultimately improving its responsive to international affairs. I hope that UN reforms can make the global governance system more fair, just, and efficient. Ensure that the interests of developing and underdeveloped countries are safeguarded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kairon. And thank you everybody for waiting. Sorry, we've done 1 hour, 30 minutes now. And my internet is fluctuating because of the weather. So I want to say thank you to everybody that came for the event, those that waited and those that unfortunately could not wait. I want to tell you that we will summarize the outcomes of this event and get it across to you. I am very deeply appreciative to everyone that committed resources and time to make this event a reality. I can see that some of my colleagues from the Global NGO Executive Committee are here. I saw Guru was here, the Vice President, Joseph Dremeyer, Sandra Timmerman. I appreciate. I also saw my friend, Vitorino Melo Olivia from the Permanent Mission of Portugal in an observatory status. He's been here. I want to say thank you to all of you, and we will send the recommendations of this meeting to the UN. They will hear our input. We pray and hope that Africa, at last, will have a seat at the United Nations Security Council and other countries as well. I want to thank Elise from Oxfam, Monica, Malaki, all the speakers, Annette, Maureen Kandu, everyone that made this event a reality. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you guys some other time. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank
bye-bye.
you. Have a
Thank
nice
you.
day.
Well done.
Have a nice day.
Really great.
Thank you.